I never imagined my daughter's engagement dinner would become the most humiliating night of my life. Everyone at the table smiled politely, until my future son-in-law's family switched to French, convinced I couldn't understand a single word. They laughed. They judged me. They even questioned whether I deserved to be part of their family. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 5 years living in Paris, and I understood every word they said. I could have exposed them immediately. Instead, I stayed silent, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't speaking first. It's letting people reveal who they really are. Before we begin, tell me in the comments. If you were in my place, would you have exposed them immediately, or stayed silent? And if you enjoy emotional family stories with unforgettable endings, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let me tell you what really happened. I still remember the exact moment the room went quiet, not because someone had raised their voice, not because anyone had dropped a glass, but because, for just a few seconds, I realized I understood every single word they thought I wasn't supposed to. They smiled politely across the table. They lifted their wine glasses. They complimented the food. And then they switched to French. They assumed I couldn't understand a thing. That assumption changed everything. If I had interrupted them right then, my daughter probably would have cancelled the wedding. If I had pretended not to hear them, I might have regretted it for the rest of my life. So I did something neither of them expected. I listened. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 67 years old, a retired history professor from Boston, and until that evening, I believed I had raised my daughter well enough to recognize the difference between kindness and appearances. Emily has always been the brightest part of my life. After my wife, Susan, passed away from breast cancer 12 years ago, it was just the two of us. We learned how to survive grief together. I burned more dinners than I care to admit. She patiently taught me how to use grocery delivery apps, and every Sunday evening we still watched old movies in the same living room where her mother used to knit. Those quiet traditions became our way of keeping Susan close. Emily grew into the kind of woman every parent hopes to raise. Hard-working, thoughtful, and endlessly curious. She never cared much about expensive brands or fancy parties. She cared about people, or at least, I thought she still did. When she called me one rainy Tuesday evening and told me she was engaged, I couldn't stop smiling. "Dad," she laughed over the phone, "you're going to love him." "I don't have to love him," I teased. "He just has to deserve you." She laughed again. "I think he does." His name was Daniel Laurent. He worked in international finance, had grown up between Montreal and Paris, and spoke both English and French effortlessly. Emily met him during a non-profit fundraising project nearly 2 years earlier. Every story she told about him sounded genuine. He volunteered on weekends. He remembered birthdays. He opened doors without making a show of it. Most importantly, he made Emily laugh in a way I hadn't heard since before her mother died. For that reason alone, I wanted to believe he was the right man. I met Daniel several times before the engagement dinner. He was polite, respectful, maybe a little too careful. Sometimes he looked like a man, trying very hard to keep everyone happy at the same time. I didn't think much of it then. Now I wish I had. A week before the dinner, Emily called again. "My parents want to host everyone at Le Cygne," she said excitedly. I recognized the restaurant immediately, one of the finest French restaurants in Boston. Elegant, expensive, the kind of place where people cared more about which fork you picked up than whether anyone at the table felt welcome. "You'll come, won't you?" she asked. "I wouldn't miss it." She hesitated. "There is one thing." "What is it?" "My future in-laws can be a little formal." I smiled into the phone. "Emily, I've lectured in front of 500 college freshmen during final exams. I think I can survive one dinner." She laughed. But her silence afterward lingered just long enough to make me wonder what she hadn't said. At the time, I convinced myself she was simply nervous about introducing two families. I had no idea that before dessert arrived, I would hear a conversation they never intended me to understand, and once those words were spoken, nothing about that engagement dinner would ever feel the same again. The evening of the engagement dinner, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than I normally would. Not because I cared about impressing anyone. At my age, you stop worrying about being the most interesting person in the room, but you never stop hoping your child feels proud to introduce you. I straightened the navy blue tie Susan had bought me nearly 15 years earlier. It wasn't expensive. The edges had softened with age, and the fabric carried faint memories of weddings, graduations, and anniversaries. Every important chapter of my life seemed to begin with that tie. I almost chose a newer one. Instead, I smiled at my reflection. "One more family milestone," I whispered, as though Susan might somehow hear me. Before leaving, I picked up the engagement gift, resting on the dining table. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't money. It was something I had spent almost 6 months creating, an old leather-bound family journal. Inside were photographs Emily had never seen. Pictures of her mother as a teenager, our first apartment, our honeymoon in Maine. Letters Susan had written while Emily was still in kindergarten, even recipes written in her own handwriting, complete with tiny coffee stains on the corners of the pages. On the first page, I had written only one sentence. Families aren't remembered for perfect moments. They're remembered for the love that survived imperfect ones. I hoped Daniel would understand why that mattered. The restaurant was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished wooden floors. Soft piano music floated through the room. Every table seemed carefully arranged, as though even the flowers had rehearsed where to stand. Emily spotted me almost immediately. "There you are." She hugged me tightly. For a second, she wasn't a 31-year-old bride-to-be. She was my little girl again. "You look handsome, Dad. So do you." She spun once, laughing. Her cream-colored dress was elegant without trying too hard. She looked genuinely happy. That was enough for me. Daniel approached a moment later. He shook my hand firmly before pulling me into a brief hug. "I'm really glad you came, Michael. I wouldn't have missed this." His smile was sincere. If he felt nervous, he hid it well. Then he turned toward the entrance. "My parents just arrived." I followed his gaze. A tall, silver-haired gentleman entered first, followed by an impeccably dressed woman whose posture reminded me of someone permanently posing for a magazine cover. Behind them came Daniel's younger sister, Camille, carrying herself with quiet confidence. Daniel greeted them in French. His mother kissed both his cheeks. His father gave him a quick embrace. Everything looked warm, normal.
Exactly what I expected from a family celebrating an engagement. Daniel introduced everyone.
"My father, Henri." His father nodded politely. "My mother, Colette." She smiled, the kind of smile that reached the mouth, but never quite reached the eyes. "And my sister, Camille." Camille offered a friendly handshake. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." Unlike the others, she spoke slowly, making sure every word sounded welcoming. I appreciated that dinner began pleasantly enough. We talked about travel, Emily's non-profit work, Daniel's career, Boston weather, the restaurant's history. Nothing unusual. Whenever I spoke, Henri listened politely. Colette, however, seemed more interested in examining me than listening. Her eyes drifted toward my watch, my jacket, my shoes, the gift resting beside my chair. Not once did she ask about my work or Susan or Emily's childhood. Instead, she asked questions that felt strangely measured. "So, Michael, are you fully retired now?" "I am." "And Emily grew up here?" "Yes." "You've lived in the same house all these years?" "I have." She nodded thoughtfully, though something about her expression suggested she had already formed an opinion before hearing my answers. Daniel noticed it too. Twice. I caught him quietly changing the subject whenever his mother lingered too long. On questions about money or status, Emily seemed blissfully unaware. She was too busy talking about wedding venues and honeymoon ideas. Watching her laugh made me hope I was imagining the tension Perhaps I was simply being protective. Perhaps. Then the waiter arrived to pour wine. Henry thanked him in French. Colette answered in French. Camille joined in. Within seconds, the entire conversation shifted into a language they assumed only their family could understand. Daniel hesitated. His eyes flickered toward me. For the briefest moment, he looked uncomfortable. Then he stayed silent, and that silence would become far more important than any words spoken that night. I took a slow sip of my water, not because I was thirsty, because I needed a second to be absolutely certain my ears hadn't betrayed me. It had been nearly 40 years since I lived in Paris. 40 years since I defended my doctoral research at the Sorbonne. 40 years since French had been part of my everyday life, instead of something I occasionally used while reading old history journals. But languages don't disappear, not the ones that become part of who you are. You may stop speaking them. You never really stop understanding them. Henry set his wineglass on the table and glanced toward me. Then, in flawless French, he said quietly, "He seems simpler than I expected." Colette barely looked in my direction. "Emily is charming," she replied, "but she clearly inherited her manners from her mother." A small smile appeared on Camille's face, not because she agreed. Because she looked uncomfortable. She lowered her eyes and reached for her napkin instead of adding anything. I kept my expression calm. If someone had been watching me closely, they would have thought I was admiring the artwork hanging on the wall. Inside, however, I felt something tighten. Not anger. Disappointment. Daniel shifted in his chair. He understood exactly what his parents were saying. He also knew I was sitting less than 4 feet away. Still, he said nothing. Emily leaned toward me. "Dad, have you decided where you're taking your retirement trip?" I smiled at her. "I've been thinking about Italy." "I knew it," she laughed. Mom always wanted to go. She had no idea that another conversation was happening right beside hers, almost like 2 completely different dinners were taking place at the same table. Henri spoke again. "Do you think he'll contribute much to the wedding?" Colette answered before Daniel had the chance. "I doubt it. Did you see his watch? And that jacket looks at least 10 years old." She gave a tiny, almost invisible shrug. "Emily will eventually have to adapt to our way of living." I instinctively looked down at my jacket. She wasn't wrong. It was nearly 12 years old. Susan had helped me pick it out after I received tenure at the university. Every time I wore it, I remembered the way she had laughed, because I complained about the price for nearly an hour before finally buying it. To Colette, it was an outdated jacket. To me, it was one of the few things that still carried traces of my wife. Funny how differently people measure value. Daniel quietly cleared his throat. "Mother," she looked at him. "What?" he answered in English. "I think Michael would enjoy hearing about your vineyard." For a brief moment I wondered if he was trying to redirect the conversation or protect me. Colette smiled politely. Then, as though nothing had happened, she returned to French. "Don't worry. He has no idea what we're saying." Henri chuckled softly. "That's probably for the best." Camille finally looked up. There was hesitation in her eyes, almost guilt. She spoke so quietly I nearly missed it. "Maybe we shouldn't," her mother interrupted immediately. "Camille, honestly, we're only being realistic." Daniel stared at his plate. His fingers tightened around his fork. He wasn't comfortable. That much was obvious. But discomfort isn't the same thing as courage. Sometimes silence protects peace. Other times, it protects the wrong people. The waiter arrived with our appetizers before anyone spoke again. As he placed each plate on the table, he smiled warmly. "Everything all right this evening?" Everyone answered yes, including me, especially me, because the truth was, I wanted to know just how far they were willing to go when they believed the only person they were insulting couldn't understand a single word. And unfortunately, they were only getting started. The appetizers looked almost too beautiful to eat. Tiny portions, perfectly arranged, every herb placed with surgical precision. Emily laughed as she tried to pronounce one of the French names on the menu. I've probably butchered that. Daniel smiled. You actually said it pretty well. It was a small, ordinary exchange. The kind of moment that reminded me why I had come. Not to judge anyone, not to prove anything, simply to celebrate my daughter's happiness. I wanted that feeling to last. Unfortunately, someone else had different plans. Henri took another sip of wine before leaning slightly toward his wife. His voice remained calm, measured, confident enough that he never imagined I understood him. She's much warmer than I expected. Colette nodded. She'll fit in eventually. Then she glanced at me. If she spends less time around this. She didn't point. She didn't have to. I knew exactly who she meant. For the first time that evening, I felt something colder than disappointment. Not because she insulted me, because she spoke about me, as though I weren't sitting 3 feet away, as though I had somehow become part of the furniture. Present. But not worthy of acknowledgement. Camille quietly set down her fork. Mom, she said it in English, just one word, nothing more. Colette looked at her daughter. Camille immediately fell silent again. I noticed the exchange, so did Daniel. He rubbed the bridge of his nose before forcing another smile toward Emily. She never noticed. She was excitedly showing everyone photographs of possible wedding venues on her phone. Look at this one, she said. It has a little garden where the ceremony would be. Henri complimented the venue in English. It's beautiful. Then, almost effortlessly, he returned to French. Outdoor weddings are lovely. A short pause. Although I hope her father doesn't insist on giving one of those long, sentimental speeches. Colette laughed under her breath. Can you imagine? Henry smiled. Americans love making everything emotional. I almost smiled myself. If only they knew. I wasn't even born in America. I immigrated with my parents from England when I was 12. Life has a funny way of making assumptions look foolish. The waiter returned to refill our glasses. He greeted Henri in French. Henri answered confidently. The waiter then turned to me with the same polite smile. For you, sir? His accent immediately told me he was from southern France, probably somewhere near Toulouse. For one brief second, I considered answering him in French. The opportunity was right there. One sentence. That was all it would take. The entire evening would change. Instead, I simply smiled. Yes, thank you. English. Nothing else. The waiter nodded and moved on. Across the table, Colette looked almost amused. See? She whispered. Exactly what I told you. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew, or at least, he suspected something. I caught him studying me for several seconds, not with pity, with curiosity. Almost as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Had Emily ever mentioned my years in Paris? Had I forgotten to tell him? Or had everyone simply assumed that a retired history professor from Boston couldn't possibly speak fluent French? People often hear only the parts of your life they expect to hear. Everything else becomes invisible. Emily reached for my hand. Dad, I looked at her. You've been awfully quiet. I smiled gently. I'm listening. She squeezed my hand. You always do. Those 4 words hit harder than any insult I'd heard all evening, because she was right. I had always listened. When she cried after losing her first job, when she doubted herself in college, when she stayed awake all night after her mother died because she couldn't bear the silence. Listening had always been how I loved her, and now, listening was showing me a side of her future family that she couldn't even see. Dessert menus arrived a few minutes later. The atmosphere relaxed, at least for everyone else. Henry closed his menu and spoke quietly enough that he thought only his family could hear. There's still one thing we need to discuss. Colette looked interested. What? Henri glanced toward the leather journal resting beside my chair. Then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Whether that little gift is all he's bringing into our family. For the first time all evening, the silence at the table felt heavier than the words themselves. I looked at the journal beside my chair. For a moment, I forgot where I was. My thumb brushed against the worn leather cover. Inside those pages were 34 years of memories, some of them so personal that I had almost convinced myself to keep them forever. Suzanne's handwriting, Emily's first crayon drawing, the hospital bracelet from the day she was born, the postcard Susan mailed me during a conference in Chicago that simply read, "Come home soon. Emily keeps asking when Daddy will be back." There wasn't a dollar amount in that journal. There couldn't be. Some things lose their value the moment you try to put a price on them. Across the table, Emily noticed me looking at it. "Dad," she smiled, "you still haven't told me what's inside. I wanted you to open it at home." "Oh, now I'm even more curious." Daniel leaned forward. "I think that's a wonderful idea." His voice sounded genuine. Before Emily could answer, Colette smiled politely. So thoughtful. Then she switched back to French. "Sentimental gifts are lovely." She paused just long enough for Henri to finish the sentence. "When someone has nothing else to offer." Neither of them laughed. That somehow made it worse. The words weren't meant as a joke. They were simply their honest opinion. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Years of teaching had given me one unexpected skill. When students became disrespectful, losing your temper only rewarded them. Silence often revealed much more than anger ever could, so I remained silent. Camille did not. She gently placed her fork on the plate. "Mom," this time she spoke in French, "please stop." Colette frowned. "We're having a private conversation. Not if someone understands us." Henri smiled confidently. "No one here does." Daniel immediately looked at his sister. His expression changed, not fear, recognition. For the first time all evening, he realized there was another possibility. His eyes slowly moved toward me. I was calmly cutting a piece of salmon. Nothing about my face had changed. Nothing about my posture. But I could almost see the question forming in his mind. Does he understand? He studied me for several seconds. I looked up, our eyes met. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to ask something. Instead, Emily interrupted. "So," she looked around the table excitedly, "we still haven't decided where everyone should sit during the ceremony." The conversation shifted again. Wedding guests, music, flowers, photography. Ordinary topics, save topics. For nearly 15 minutes, nobody spoke French. The tension slowly faded. Even I started wondering whether, perhaps, the worst had already passed. Then the waiter returned carrying dessert. He rolled a polished wooden cart beside our table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "our chef has prepared today's specialties." There was a lemon tart dark chocolate soufflé, crème brûlée, and a pear tart that reminded me of a little café Susan and I used to visit in Paris. The smell alone brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. The waiter smiled at Daniel. "Would anyone like my recommendation?" Daniel looked toward his parents. Henry answered in French without hesitation. "Ask everyone except him." He tilted his head ever so slightly in my direction. "He'll probably choose whatever is cheapest anyway." Colette let out a quiet laugh. Old habits are difficult to break. Camille closed her eyes, just for a second. She looked genuinely embarrassed. Daniel didn't move. His face had gone completely still. He wasn't looking at his parents anymore. He was looking at me, watching, waiting. As if he had finally noticed something everyone else had missed, because despite every insult, despite every assumption, despite hearing them reduce my entire life to the price of my jacket and the value of my gift, I hadn't reacted once, not a flinch, not a sigh, not even confusion. Only someone who understood every word could remain that calm. Daniel's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. I could see the realization arriving piece by piece, and then the waiter turned toward me with a courteous smile. "In case you'd like something traditional, sir." He hesitated for a moment before continuing in French. "May I recommend the tarte aux poires? It's one of our chef's finest desserts." The entire table waited for my answer. What I said next would determine how the rest of the evening would be remembered. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The waiter stood beside me patiently, still smiling. completely unaware that the next few seconds were about to change the atmosphere at our table forever. I looked up at him. Then, in the same effortless French I had once spoken every single day, I smiled warmly. The pear tart would be wonderful. And if Chef Laurent is still using brown butter in the filling, please tell him he's made an excellent decision. It reminds me of a little bistro on Rue Claire where I used to eat after my lectures. The waiter's eyes lit up. You know Paris? I chuckled softly. Quite well. I lived there for nearly 5 years while completing my doctorate. I haven't spoken French regularly in decades, so forgive me if my accent has become a little rusty. Rusty, the waiter laughed. Sir, your French is better than mine. For a second, the restaurant seemed to disappear. I wasn't looking at the waiter anymore. I was looking at the faces across the table. Henri had frozen with his wineglass halfway to his lips. Colette's smile vanished so quickly it was almost startling. Camille slowly lowered her eyes. Daniel simply closed them, just for an instant, as if the moment he had feared had finally arrived. Emily looked from one face to another, then back at me. Dad, she blinked. You speak French? I smiled. I do. Her eyebrows shot up. Since when? Since I was about 26. You never told me. I suppose it never seemed important. The waiter excused himself to place the dessert order. As soon as he walked away, silence settled over the table. Not awkward silence, heavy silence. The kind that forces people to hear their own thoughts. Nobody reached for their glass. Nobody touched their dessert spoon. Finally, Henri cleared his throat. Incredible, he forced a smile. I had no idea, I know. I answered in English. My voice remained calm. So did I. Colette tried to laugh, a wonderful surprise. It certainly was. Another silence. Emily frowned. She looked at Daniel. Why does it feel like something just happened? Daniel stared at the table, his fingers tightened around his napkin. No one answered her. She turned toward me instead. Dad? I met her eyes. Everything's all right. It wasn't a lie. I wasn't angry anymore. In fact, the anger had disappeared the moment I answered the waiter. What remained was clarity. Henri finally spoke again. In that case, he smiled nervously. You must have understood our conversation. I did. No accusation, no raised voice. Just 3 simple words. The color drained from Colette's face. Camille covered her eyes for a brief moment. Daniel inhaled slowly. Emily looked completely confused. What convey? She answered. She looked at Daniel, then at his parents, then back at me. What conversation? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Colette attempted another smile. Oh, it was nothing important. I looked at her. No, I said gently. It was important. She swallowed. I think you've misunderstood. I don't believe I did. Again, my voice never rose. Several nearby diners continued enjoying their meals without the slightest idea that an entire family's image was quietly collapsing only a few feet away. Emily's smile disappeared. She looked directly at Daniel. What did they say? Daniel still couldn't meet her eyes. His voice barely escaped. I should have stopped it. Emily stared at him. Stop what? Those 4 words hung over the table. No one rescued him. Not his father, not his mother, not even me. Because some truths have to be spoken by the people responsible for them. Daniel finally lifted his head. His eyes were full of shame. They thought your father couldn't understand French. Emily looked at me, then back at him. And he took a shaky breath, and they started talking about him. The silence that followed was louder than any argument I had ever witnessed. And for the first time that entire evening, Emily wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the people she had been preparing to call family. The disappointment on her face hurt them. Far more than anything I could ever have said. No one reached for dessert. The pear tart sat untouched in front of me, its steam slowly fading into the quiet air. Emily looked at Daniel as if she no longer recognized him. I asked you a question. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. What exactly did they say? Daniel swallowed hard. His father finally leaned forward. Emily, perhaps we're making this into something larger than it was. She didn't even look at him. "I'm not talking to you." Henry leaned back again. For the first time that evening, his confidence seemed to disappear. Daniel took a slow breath. He rubbed his forehead. "They said your father seemed simple." Emily's expression didn't change. "And they questioned whether he'd contribute anything meaningful to the wedding." Another pause. "They criticized his clothes." His voice became quieter. "They said, 'Sentimental gifts usually come from people who have nothing else to offer.'" Emily's eyes filled with disbelief. She turned toward her future mother-in-law. "You said that?" Colette straightened in her chair. "I think you're taking our private family conversation out of context." I finally spoke. There wasn't much context to misunderstand. She looked at me. "Mr. Carter." "Michael is fine." Another silence. "I never interrupted your conversation. I never embarrassed you. I simply listened." Colette forced another smile. "In France, families often speak frankly among themselves." Camille looked at her mother. "No, Mom." Her voice was calm. "Please don't hide behind culture." Everyone looked at her. She continued. "You weren't being French, you were being unkind." Colette blinked. "Camille." "No." Camille shook her head gently. "I wanted you to stop before. I should have spoken sooner." Henry sighed heavily. "This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic." I looked at him. "Actually, it's becoming honest." His jaw tightened. "I made an observation. You made a judgment," I answered. "Those are not the same thing." Emily slowly turned toward me. "Dad," her voice broke. "Why didn't you tell me?" I smiled sadly. What would have happened if I'd interrupted after the first sentence? She didn't answer. "You would have been embarrassed. You would have defended me. And your engagement dinner would have become an argument." She lowered her eyes. "I wanted everyone to reveal who they were before I decided who needed to hear my voice." Daniel stared at me. "You knew." "I suspected." "You know." He shook his head. I nodded once. "I knew from your father's very first sentence." Daniel covered his face with one hand. "I should have stopped them." "You should have." I said it gently. "Not as punishment, simply as truth. I kept waiting for you to." His shoulders sank. I was afraid of humiliating my parents, and instead, I looked at him quietly. "You allowed my father to be humiliated." Emily finished the sentence for him. Daniel closed his eyes. There was no defense left. Only regret. The waiter returned with dessert. Smiling as though nothing unusual had happened, he placed each plate carefully before us. No one touched theirs. He sensed the tension immediately. "I hope everything is all right." I smiled warmly. "The food looks wonderful." He nodded politely before leaving. As soon as he disappeared, I opened the leather journal and slid it across the table toward Emily. "I think this belongs to you now." She looked at the cover. "Dad, I was going to wait until after dinner." I smiled softly. But life doesn't always wait for the perfect moment. She opened the first page. The moment she saw her mother's handwriting, her lips trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she even turned to the second page. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Dad." She carefully lifted one of Susan's old letters. Her fingertips shook as she recognized the familiar handwriting. She'd spent 12 years wishing she could see again. Daniel looked at the pages. Then at his own parents, then back at the journal. For the first time that evening, he finally understood exactly how poor they had been. Not financially, emotionally, and judging by the look on his face, that realization hurt far more than any words I could have spoken. Etmate carefully closed the journal. She didn't wipe away her tears. She simply rested both hands on the worn leather cover, as though she were afraid it might disappear if she let go. "I've never seen these before." "I know," I smiled. "Your mother wanted you to have them when the time felt right." She looked at one of the photographs again. It showed Susan standing in our tiny first apartment, flour on her face after a failed attempt at baking bread. Emily laughed through her tears. "She looks just like me. You look just like her when you laugh." For the first time that evening, everyone smiled. Everyone except Henri and Colette. They sat in complete silence. not because they had nothing to say, because nothing they could say would improve what had already happened. Emily slowly closed the journal again. Then she turned toward Colette. "I need to ask you something." Colette straightened in her chair. "Of course, when you looked at this gift." Emily rested her hand on the journal. "Did you really think it meant my father had nothing else to offer?" Colette hesitated. "It wasn't meant the way it sounded." Emily didn't interrupt. She waited. The silence forced Colette to continue. "I judged too quickly." Emily nodded once. "Yes, you did." Henry cleared his throat. "We've already apologized." I looked at him calmly. "No, you've acknowledged that I understood you. That's different." The words landed harder than I intended, because they were true. An apology isn't saying, "I'm sorry you hurt me." An apology is saying, "I'm sorry I became the kind of person who said it." Henry lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Daniel finally pushed his chair back slightly. He looked directly at me.
"Michael," his voice was steady now, "I owe you more than an apology."
I remained silent. I've spent my entire life trying to keep peace inside my family. He gave a small, bitter smile. I convinced myself that staying quiet made me respectful. He looked toward his parents. Tonight I realized silence can also make you a coward. No one argued with him. Not even Henri. Daniel turned back to me. "When my mother criticized your jacket, I should have stopped her. When my father mocked your gift, I should have stopped him. When they treated you like you didn't belong, I should have reminded them that this dinner wasn't about status. It was about family." His voice cracked on the last word, and I failed. Emily reached for his hand, but she didn't take it, not yet. She looked at him for several long seconds. "I don't need someone who has perfect parents." She spoke quietly. "I need someone who's willing to do the right thing when his parents are wrong." Daniel nodded. "I understand." "No," she answered gently. "I hope you do." Another long silence followed. Then something happened that surprised all of us. Camille stood up. She walked around the table until she reached my chair. "I don't know if this means much," she said softly, "but I'd like to apologize too. You were welcomed into our family with judgment instead of gratitude." She extended her hand. "I don't want that to be the memory you keep of me." Instead of shaking it, I stood up and gave her a brief hug. "You've already done something your parents struggled to do tonight." She looked confused. "What?" "You spoke up." She smiled sadly. "I wish I'd done it sooner, but sooner is impossible. The next best time is now." She nodded quietly before returning to her seat. Across the table, I noticed tears gathering in Colette's eyes. Real tears, not dramatic, not performative. She looked at Camille, then at Emily. She looked at me. I spent so much of my life worrying about how my family appeared to other people. Her voice trembled. That I forgot how we appeared to the people sitting right in front of us. No one interrupted. I was cruel. She whispered the words almost to herself. "There isn't another word for it." She slowly reached across the table, not toward me, toward the leather journal. She rested her fingertips lightly on its cover. I spent the entire evening wondering how much this gift cost. She looked up, tears running freely now. I never stopped to wonder how much love it contained. For the first time that night, her apology wasn't for being caught. It was for finally understanding. And somehow, that made all the difference. The drive home was quieter than I expected. Emily insisted on riding with me instead of leaving with Daniel. Neither of us turned on the radio. The city lights slipped past the windows, while the journal rested carefully on her lap, both hands wrapped around it as though it contained something alive. Finally, she broke the silence. "I feel like I met two completely different families tonight." I kept my eyes on the road. "You did." She looked down at the journal. "I keep replaying everything they said. You'll drive yourself crazy if you do." "I know," she sighed. "But I can't stop thinking about one thing." "What?" She turned toward me. "You never looked angry." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I was. You didn't show it. When your mother got sick, I paused. She taught me something. Emily waited. She said anger is expensive. If you're going to spend it, make sure it's buying something worthwhile. I glanced at her for just a second. Tonight, silence brought me the truth. Emily stared out the window. I miss her. So do I. The rest of the drive passed without another word. When we reached my house, Emily surprised me. Instead of saying good night, she walked inside as though she had done it 1,000 times before. She placed the journal on the kitchen table. Then she started making tea, exactly the way Susan used to. Watching her measure the tea leaves brought back memories so vivid they almost hurt. She noticed me smiling. "What? You hold the kettle exactly like your mother." She laughed softly. I never realized. Most of the little things people inherit aren't intentional. They simply become part of them. A few minutes later, we were sitting at the same old oak table where Emily had done homework as a little girl. She slowly opened the journal again. One page, then another. Every few minutes she smiled. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed through the tears. After nearly an hour, she stopped at a folded envelope. "Dad, I don't think I've ever seen this." "You haven't." She carefully unfolded the letter. It was written only 3 months before Susan died. Emily read silently for several minutes. Then she handed it to me. "I think Mum was talking to both of us." The final paragraph caught my attention immediately. If Emily ever chooses someone to spend her life with, I hope she never looks for the richest person in the room. I hope she looks for the kindest. Money builds comfortable houses. Kindness builds homes people never want to leave. I swallowed hard. Even after 12 years, Susan still knew exactly what needed to be said. Emily carefully folded the letter again. "I don't know if I can marry Daniel." Her words hung in the room. I answered honestly. "I don't know either." She looked surprised. "You always have advice." "Not this time." "Why?" "Because this isn't a decision about love. It's a decision about character." She looked at the table. "Do you think people can change?" I thought about Henri, about Colette, about Camille, about Daniel sitting silently while his parents tore apart a man he barely knew. Finally, I answered, "I think people change every day. The real question is, do they change because they were embarrassed, or because they finally understood?" The next afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID simply read, Daniel Laurent. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Daniel." There was a long silence on the other end. Then I heard him exhale. "Michael, I've asked my parents not to contact Emily for a while." I didn't respond. I also cancelled every wedding meeting we had planned this week. Another pause. "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Would you meet me? Just the two of us." His voice sounded different, less polished, less rehearsed, almost honest. I looked out the kitchen window where Susan had once spent entire afternoons tending her roses. Some conversations change relationships. Others reveal whether there is still one left to save. I had a feeling this meeting would decide which kind this would be. Daniel chose a small cafe overlooking the Charles River. Not one of the expensive places his parents preferred. Just a quiet neighborhood cafe where no one cared what watch you wore or what language you spoke. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Professors learn quickly that arriving late encourages everyone else to do the same. Daniel walked in carrying no briefcase, no designer coat, no polished smile. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. When he reached the table, he didn't sit down immediately. I almost cancelled. I looked up. Why? Because I wasn't sure I deserved this conversation. I gestured toward the empty chair. "Sit down anyway." He nodded. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. The waitress brought coffee. Daniel wrapped both hands around the mug without taking a sip. Finally, he looked at me. "I've replayed that dinner 100 times. So have I. I keep thinking." He hesitated. "If I had interrupted my father after the first comment, none of the rest would have happened." "You're right." He lowered his head. "I've always believed respecting your parents meant never contradicting them." I stirred my coffee slowly. My father believed children should never question adults. Daniel looked at me. Did you agree with him? No. So I questioned him. What happened? We didn't speak for almost a year. Daniel seemed surprised. I didn't know that. Most people don't. I smiled faintly. They only see the peaceful ending. They never see the difficult decisions that made peace possible. He leaned back. My parents sacrificed everything for me. They immigrated. They worked constantly. They gave me opportunities they never had. I've spent my whole life trying to repay them. I understand. But somewhere along the way, his voice cracked. I confused gratitude with obedience. The words hung between us. I nodded slowly. That happens more often than you think. He stared into his coffee. When my mother started criticizing your jacket, I heard Susan. He looked confused. My wife, she always said. I smiled to myself. Pay attention to how people treat someone who can't benefit them. Daniel didn't say anything. Your parents believed I couldn't understand them, so they showed me exactly who they were when they thought there would be no consequences. He closed his eyes. I know. No, I answered gently. I think you're just beginning to. A few moments passed before he reached into his coat pocket. I brought something. He placed a small velvet box on the table. I frowned. I don't understand. It's not for you. He pushed it toward me. Would you give it to Emily? I opened the box. Inside was an engagement ring. I looked back at him. You bought another ring? He nodded. This was my grandmother's. My mother's mother. The woman who raised her. He smiled sadly. She was the kindest person I've ever known. So why isn't Emily wearing this one already? My parents said it wasn't impressive enough. They wanted a larger diamond. They said appearances mattered. He laughed bitterly, so I listened. He looked out the cafe window. My grandmother would have hated that. I closed the box carefully. What are you asking me to do? I've postponed the wedding. I told Emily she deserves time. And if... He struggled to finish the sentence. If she decides she still wants to marry me someday, I want her to have the ring that represents the values I should have protected in the first place. I studied him quietly. You understand that changing rings won't fix what happened. I know. I don't want to fix the dinner. I can't. I want to become the man who would have stopped it. For the first time since we sat down, I believed him not, because his words were perfect, because they weren't. There were pauses, mistakes, regret. Real change rarely sounds rehearsed. As we stood to leave, Daniel stopped beside the cafe door. Michael, may I ask you one question? Of course. When did you decide to forgive my parents? I smiled gently. I haven't. His face fell, then I continued. Forgiveness isn't a decision you announce. It's something you discover one ordinary day when remembering no longer hurts. He thought about that for a long moment. So, there's still hope? I looked toward the river where the morning sunlight shimmered across the water. Hope has never been the problem. The question is whether your family is willing to do the hard work that hope requires. 3 days later, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Henry and Colette were standing on my porch. Neither of them was carrying flowers, or wine, or an expensive gift, just something far more difficult. The truth they should have brought to the restaurant. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Henry looked older than he had only 3 days earlier. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he had worn like a tailored suit at the restaurant was gone. Colette stood beside him, with both hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked as though she had rehearsed this moment 100 times, and forgotten every line. I hope we're not intruding, Henri said quietly. I stepped aside. Come in. The house was exactly as it had been for years. Bookshelves lined the walls. Susan's piano still stood near the living room window. Family photographs filled the mantel, nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress, only a lifetime of ordinary moments. Colette slowly walked toward one of the photographs. It showed Susan planting tomatoes in the backyard while 6-year-old Emily held a tiny watering can upside down. She smiled sadly. She had kind eyes. I nodded. She did. I wish I'd known her. So do I. We sat in the living room. No one reached for coffee, no one asked about the weather. There wasn't room for small talk anymore. Henry leaned forward first. I've spent the last 3 nights thinking about something. I waited. I realized, he exhaled slowly. I don't actually know why I judged you. I raised an eyebrow. I assumed he answered his own question. I saw an older man in an old jacket carrying a handmade gift. I filled in the rest of the story myself. He looked around my home. I never once considered that I might be completely wrong. No, I said gently. You never asked. He nodded. No, I didn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. Colette finally spoke. I visited my mother's grave yesterday. The sentence surprised everyone. Even Henri looked at her. I hadn't been in almost a year. She stared at her hands. She used to write me letters. She laughed softly through tears. I kept every one of them. She looked up at me, and then I remembered what I said about your journal. Her voice broke. I spent half the night reading those letters. I couldn't stop thinking. What if someone had looked at that box and said, "That's all your mother left you?" A tear rolled down her cheek. I would have been devastated. She covered her face for a moment. I did to you exactly what would have broken my own heart. No one interrupted. Some realizations deserve silence. Henry reached into the inside pocket of his coat. I brought something. He carefully placed a folded sheet of paper on the coffee table. I looked at it. What is it? My resignation. I frowned.
From what? I've chaired the admissions committee at the Laurent Family Foundation for almost 12 years.
I've always believed we rewarded excellence. He smiled bitterly. Last night I realized we've often rewarded polish. He pushed the letter closer. I resigned because I need to decide whether I've been building opportunity or simply protecting privilege. I looked at him for a long moment. That wasn't a symbolic gesture. It carried real consequences, real sacrifice. You didn't have to do that. I know, he answered. I needed to. Colette slowly stood and walked toward the piano. Her fingertips hovered over the worn wood. Does it still play? It does. She looked back at me. Would you mind? I shook my head. She pressed a few hesitant keys. A simple melody filled the room. Not perfect, just familiar. When she finished, she whispered, "My father taught me that song." She smiled sadly. I hadn't played it in 20 years. I stood beside the piano. Susan used to play it every Sunday morning. Colette closed the lid gently. Maybe. She looked at me. We've spent so much time trying to look like an exceptional family that we forgot how to simply be one. At that exact moment, the front door opened. Emily stepped inside. She froze. Daniel was standing behind her. Neither of them had expected to find his parents sitting in my living room. For a brief second, everyone looked at everyone else. No one knew who should speak first. Then Colette quietly walked toward Emily. She didn't offer excuses. She didn't defend herself. She simply said the 4 words she should have spoken the night of the dinner. I was deeply wrong. Emily searched her face, not for tears, not for guilt, for sincerity. And this time, she found it. Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked at Colette for several long seconds, long enough that no one in the room dared to speak. Finally, she asked one simple question. What changed? Colette didn't rush her answer. I stopped thinking about being forgiven and started thinking about the person I had become. Emily nodded slowly. My dad says those are 2 different journeys. I smiled to myself. She'd been listening all these years. Colette glanced toward me. He was right. She turned back to Emily. I don't expect you to trust me today. I don't even expect you to like me. But I couldn't allow the last thing you remembered about me to be the woman you met at that restaurant. Emily looked down. That's exactly who I thought you were. I know. And if that's all I ever am in your memory, Colette's voice trembled, I'll deserve it. Daniel remained near the front door. He hadn't said a word since arriving. He understood this wasn't his moment. Henry finally stood. I owe you an explanation too, Emily. She folded her arms. I'm listening. I grew up with very little. His voice was quiet, so little that I promised myself my children would never struggle the way I did. He smiled sadly. Somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting them from hardship and started protecting them from ordinary people. The room fell silent. I convinced myself that success looked a certain way. He glanced around my home. This house reminded me how wrong I was. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Henry looked toward the bookshelf. I've never seen so many family photographs. He pointed toward Susan's old rocking chair. Or furniture that clearly stayed because someone loved it instead of because it matched. He smiled faintly. My house has become beautiful. He paused. I'm no longer sure it feels lived in. No one spoke, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Daniel finally stepped forward. I've made a decision. Emily looked at him. I resigned from my father's investment firm this morning. Henry nodded once. It's true. Emily blinked. You... What? Daniel smiled nervously. I've accepted a position with the non-profit where we met. She stared at him. That's a huge pay cut. I know. Why would you do that? He looked directly at her. Because I spent years building the life my parents admired. He took another breath. I'd rather spend the rest of my life building one I'd actually be proud to live. Tears filled Emily's eyes again. Not because of the job. Because, for the first time since the engagement dinner, she believed his actions more than his words. I quietly walked into the kitchen. Sometimes families need privacy, even when they're standing in your living room. A few minutes later, I returned carrying a tray with 4 mugs of tea. The same tea Susan had served every guest who ever walked through our front door. I handed the first mug to Henri. He looked surprised. After everything that happened, "You'd still make tea for us?" I smiled. My wife used to say, "Hospitality says more about the host than the guest." He lowered his eyes. "I don't deserve this." "Probably not," I answered honestly. "But kindness isn't something we offer only to people who deserve it. It's something we choose because of who we are." No one touched their tea for a moment. Then Camille laughed softly. Everyone looked at her. "I'm sorry." She smiled through tears. "I was just thinking—" "What?" Emily asked. The whole disaster started because everyone thought Michael didn't understand French. She looked around the room, and somehow he ended up teaching all of us a language we barely knew. Henry smiled. "What language is that?" Camille looked at me. Dignity. For the first time since the engagement dinner, everyone laughed. Not loudly. Not because everything had been fixed, but because healing had finally become possible. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing beneath a canopy of maple trees, wearing the same navy blue tie Susan had bought me years before. Only this time, no one was looking at the price of the jacket. No one cared about the watch on my wrist. They were watching something far more valuable. 2 families, choosing day by day to become one. The ceremony was deliberately small, not because Daniel and Emily couldn't afford something larger, but because, after everything we'd been through, they wanted every face in attendance to be someone who had earned the right to be there. The venue overlooked a quiet lake just outside Boston. White wooden chairs lined a grassy aisle. Wildflowers replaced expensive centerpieces. A string quartet played softly beneath the shade of old maple trees. It wasn't the most luxurious wedding I'd ever attended. It was the most peaceful. As guests settled into their seats, I noticed Henri greeting every vendor by name, the florist, the photographer, even the young man arranging chairs. 6 months earlier, he probably wouldn't have noticed any of them. Now he shook every hand, asked every name, looked every person in the eye. Real change often reveals itself in the smallest habits. Colette walked over carrying a small velvet box. "I believe this belongs with the bride." She handed it to Emily. Inside was the simple vintage ring Daniel had shown me at the cafe. Emily smiled. "It's beautiful." Colette nodded. "It always was." She hesitated. I was simply too distracted by the size of another diamond to notice. Emily removed the expensive engagement ring without hesitation. Then she slipped on the older one. No applause, no dramatic speech. Just a quiet decision. Some symbols don't need an audience. The music changed. Everyone stood. Emily looked at me. "You ready, Dad?" I offered my arm. "I've been ready since the day you learned to walk." She laughed. "You always know what to say." "No." I smiled. "I've just had a very good teacher." She squeezed my arm. "I miss Mom today." "So do I, but I have a feeling." I looked toward the bright blue sky. She'd like this version better than the first one we imagined. Emily nodded. "I think so too." We began walking halfway down the aisle. She suddenly whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For protecting my happiness, without protecting me from the truth." Those words settled into my heart. Every parent wants to spare their child from pain. But sometimes, love means allowing them to see people exactly as they are. When we reached the front, I placed her hand in Daniel's. He looked at me with quiet gratitude. "I won't waste this second chance." I smiled. "Don't spend your life trying to prove it to me." He looked confused. "Spend it proving it to her." He nodded. "I will." The ceremony itself was simple. No extravagant promises, no rehearsed poetry. Just two people making ordinary vows with extraordinary sincerity. When the officiant asked if anyone wished to speak before the rings were exchanged, Daniel surprised everyone. "I'd like to say something." He turned toward the guests. "Most weddings celebrate love." He smiled at Emily. "Ours exists because of honesty." Then he looked at me. "I once believed education meant speaking several languages." He paused. I was wrong. The most important language I ever learned was respect. He walked over to me before returning to Emily. In front of every guest, he held out his hand. "Michael, thank you for answering cruelty with dignity." I shook his hand. "No," I said quietly. "Thank your future children." He looked puzzled. "Why?" "Because every decision you made after that dinner changed the kind of father you'll become." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he embraced me. Not because tradition required it, because family did. Later that evening, after the last dance and the final photographs, I wandered down to the edge of the lake alone. The reception lights shimmered across the water. Laughter echoed in the distance. I reached into my jacket pocket and unfolded one of Susan's old letters, the one Emily had returned to me after reading it. I smiled as I reread the final lines. "Kindness builds homes people never want to leave." I folded the letter carefully. "Looks like you were right again," I whispered. A gentle breeze rippled across the lake. Some people would call it coincidence. After 39 years of marriage, I preferred to think of it as a reply. As I turned back toward the celebration, I saw Daniel laughing with Henri. Camille was teaching Emily's young cousins a few French phrases. Colette stood in the middle of the dance floor with Emily, both of them laughing over a missed dance step 6 months earlier. That picture would have been impossible. Now it simply looked like family. Not perfect, not flawless, just people who had chosen humility over pride, and perhaps that is the closest any family ever comes to perfection. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in Michael's place. Do you think Daniel deserved a second chance, or was Emily right to walk away if she had chosen to? And if you enjoy heartfelt family stories with meaningful endings, don't forget to subscribe. We share a brand new story every week.